A reading from Acts. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydia was near Joppa, the disciples, who heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with this request: "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Brothers and sisters, we are comforted by the oboe and the words of the 23rd Psalm as we gather to remember our sister in the faith. She was a disciple of Christ and a pillar of faithfulness and service in our church and to the community. Her life overflowed with good works and compassionate acts on behalf of those in need. We celebrate these good works even as we mourn her passing. She was a loving mother to 3 great children who any mother would be proud to call their own. Here in our church, she served on numerous committees and various ministries over the past 2 decades. 7 years ago, she was ordained as a deacon to serve our fellowship. One of her most notable contributions was teaching music to our children for over 19 years, without any payment or very little recognition. Professionally, she taught music in public school, and for many years, until the last few, when she served as that school's counselor. In addition to tending to the needs of her students and their families, she also taught them how to be good, compassionate people who care for others in need. Just this week, she picked up from me here at the church the supplies needed for her students to assemble sack lunches and hygiene kits to be given out to our homeless friends and guests. Our great loss was heaven's gain when Shelley Newton took her last breath. Excuse me. Shelley? Shelley Newton, is that you? Well, glory be, hallelujah, you're alive. I am so sorry. I don't know how I would make such a big mistake. And Jeff, I'm sorry to you too, buddy. But I'm glad she's alive, and I guess you probably are too, yeah. And Jeff, by the way, when she does go, just give me a call. I've got it all ready here. On second thought, never mind. Odds are she'll outlive you and me both, so you can just not worry about that. I am so embarrassed. Sorry. I guess this might be a little bit what Tabitha's pastor might have felt like when he showed up to preach her funeral, only to discover that she wasn't dead anymore. I bet the next time someone died in that pastor's congregation, he made sure he got there before Peter did. So as the story goes, a well-respected and much-loved disciple became ill and died. Her Aramaic name was Tabitha, but we're told that she was also called Dorcas. Hebrew scholar Robin Branch and others believe that calling her by both names suggests how important she was to both Jewish and Gentile Christians. She was someone who walked in both worlds because she served the needs of all, regardless of race, religion, gender, or class. In either language, her name means gazelle, which gives us the image of her being a woman of grace, beauty, quickness, and energy. As Luke states, her life overflowed with good works and compassionate acts on behalf of those in need. Her death was so upsetting to the community that they sent for Peter, pleading for him to come from the next town where he had just healed a paralyzed man. We can't be for sure why they wanted Peter so badly. Was it just to bring comfort? Or did they actually think he could raise her from the dead? No matter the reason, the outcome was the same. Peter did go to Tabitha's side right away. He found her body surrounded by weeping mourners who showed him the clothing that Tabitha, their gazelle, had made for the poor when she was alive. But now, her body overtaken by illness, lay lifeless and cold. They had laid her in the room upstairs. Of course, we know from other stories that when we hear the upper room, the stage is set for something dramatic. Indeed, what happens next is dramatic. Peter shooed them from the room. He knelt. He prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then, with simple understatement, she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and he helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. Last Sunday morning, on my way into the sanctuary, I talked briefly with one of Broadway's resident theologians about this story. You say that you didn't know that Broadway has theologians in residence? Well, look around the room. That's about 2/3, or with the rain today, maybe just 1/3 of them. Anyway, I told Mary Hyatt that I would be preaching about when Peter raised Tabitha from the dead. She responded with, "Why?" I replied, "Because that's the lectionary text for next Sunday." "No," she said, "I mean, why would Peter do that? Was it Peter's idea? Because I'm sure it wasn't Tabitha's. We Christians are strange. We talk about looking forward to a wonderful life after death, and then we fight with all our strength not to go there." Many theologians seem to agree with Mary about this story having a dearth of meaning. Lewis Mudge from the Graduate Theological Union summarized these thoughts in one sentence: "It is hard to find profound theological meaning in this passage taken in isolation." But we can find meaning when we place it in context with other healing and resurrection stories. In Mark 5, we are told about the time when the leader of the synagogue's daughter falls ill and dies. Jesus is called to the house. He shoos all the others from the room except for the child's mother and father. He takes her by the hand and says, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the little girl got up and began to walk about. At this, they were overcome with amazement. Then we leap forward to our story for today. Past Jesus' death burial, resurrection, and ascension, Peter is called to the house. Peter shoos them all from the room. He kneels and prays and says, "Tabitha, get up." Jesus was called to the house. Peter was called to the house. Jesus shoos them from the room. Peter shoos them from the room. Jesus takes her by the hand and says, "Talitha, get up." Peter kneels and prays and says, "Tabitha, get up." So we have almost identical settings, storylines, and those names, Talitha, Tabitha. There are just too many coincidences for these not to be connected. When Jesus raised Talitha, it was to show that God was active in the world through Christ. When Peter raised Tabitha, it was to show that God was still active in the world, even after Jesus' death and resurrection. So Jesus lived and performed miracles to show that God was active in the world. Peter and Paul and the others performed wonders to show that God was still active in the world. And we are here today professing that God is still active in the world through the lives and actions of God's people. Through Shelley's life, God is still active in the world. Through Ethan's life, God is still active in the world. Through Mary's life, God is still active in the world. Through your life and my life, God is still active in this world. Ecclesia, koum, which means church, get up. Get up. When I first became a minister, I expected funerals to be one of the hardest things that I would ever be called on to do. I feared the sadness around death would be depressing and difficult to manage. I thought figuring out what to say about someone who had just died would be gloomy and heartrending. However, I found just the opposite. That's because a good eulogy is not a story about death. It's a story about life. A good eulogy is a fascinating tale about love, adventures, relationships, tragedy, disappointments, triumphs, kindnesses shown and kindnesses received graciously. It's about love and all that life has to offer. The people that I've met through the stories found in eulogies are some of the most fascinating people you would ever wish to meet. Several years ago, I was asked to preach the funeral for my own grandmother, Dorothy Pirtle. See, my mother is the oldest of 8 children, and I'm the youngest of 4 children. So you can do the quick math to figure out my grandmother's family has a bunch of people in it. So I spent a 10-hour car ride to Missouri listening to my parents and brother and sisters tell stories about my grandma. Then I spent the next 2 days during the funeral home visitations. 2 days of funeral home visitations. Big family. Listening to the stories from my aunts, uncles, cousins, other family and friends, some of whom I even recognized. Then, with the funeral scheduled for the next morning, I sat in the motel room and wrote until 3 a.m, weaving their stories together into one single narrative. The next day, only after the funeral, did I realize that I had left out my own stories and my own memories of my grandmother. Because they weren't written down in my notes, they didn't make it onto the page at 3 a.m, you see. But even without my own memories included, the woman I met through compiling her eulogy was indeed the grandmother that I loved, but she was so much more. I met the young mother who had never worked outside the home until her husband died of a heart attack. With the help of family and friends and odd jobs, she stayed in rural Missouri until her oldest 5 children, the earlier set of the family, had all graduated from high school. But then at that point, she packed up her 3 toddlers and moved to Phoenix, Arizona, to reinvent herself as a single professional mother in a big city. She adapted and survived. I also met an older woman who, in her own retirement, went every day either to volunteer at the church or to disabled persons' homes to take care of their needs. She continued this even when her own health was poor, and the doctor said that her heart couldn't take that level of activity. When my Uncle Lawrence pleaded with her to slow down and let other, more able-bodied persons worry about taking care of ill persons in the church, her response was, "Honey, they need me. And besides, you know, I've only got 2 speeds, stop and go. And if I slow down, then my body will just stop. Is that what you want to happen?" Needless to say, he nor anyone else brought it up again. Dorothy's eulogy was not about death, but about life, the life of an amazing woman. Today, each of us is writing our own eulogy right now. They are the stories about how we live, how we love, kindnesses that we show, injustices that we fight, generous gifts that we give. They are the stories about the ways that we prove that God is still active in this world. You see, the evidence that God is still active in this world will be found in our eulogies. Ecclesia, koum. Church, get up. Get up. It's ironic. You could hire the most eloquent poet in the world to pen the words for your funeral, and then James Earl Jones to deliver them. But the only one who can really write your eulogy is you. You're writing it every day in what you do, what you say, who you stand up for, how you spend your money, and what God you serve. So what new chapters to your eulogy will you write with your remaining decades, years, months, days, or even hours? What injustice will you correct? What stranger will you welcome? What orphan will you protect? What widow's mite or king's fortune will you give away in service to others? So on that day, when your family and friends have recited the 23rd Psalm, and they stand to sing, "Precious Lord, take my hand," what story will you have written for them to tell? And how will your story show that God is still active in this world? As I said when I greeted you today, all are welcome here to worship, to serve, to pray, to study, and to sing God's praise. Perhaps you feel God calling you to join in fellowship with us here, with this community of believers. You may come forward during this hymn, as I will be standing at the front to receive you.